This is Kim Irish from Breast Cancer Action. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will be starting in just a moment. I want to just make sure that all of our audio and everything is okay. Great. I just got confirmation that it's good, so I'm going to go ahead and start. So again, welcome. We're so glad that you could join us for our fourth webinar, How Can My Genes Be Patented? For those of you who are new to our organization, BC Action is a national education and advocacy organization that carries the voices of people affected by breast cancer to inspire and compel the changes necessary to end the breast cancer epidemic. We do this through education, activism, and policy work. As I said, my name is Kim Irish. I'm the program manager here at Breast Cancer Action. I lead our Think Before You Pink and Milking Cancer campaigns, along with our policy and education work. Today you'll be hearing from me, J.D. Hansen, Policy Director for Human Genetics at the International Center for Technology Assessment, and Eric Hoffman, Biotechnology Policy Campaigner with Friends of the Earth. I want to just make a couple of quick announcements. Please stay tuned for our next upcoming webinars, which will be held in September and October, and will focus on Breast Cancer Action's Think Before You Pink campaign. You can find details on our website at bcaction.org. And we don't take any money from corporations that profit from or contribute to the breast cancer epidemic. Our work is largely supported by individual donors, so please consider making a donation today to support work like this educational webinar. And then finally, before I turn it over to JD and Eric, I want to go over the agenda of this webinar and a few rules of webinar etiquette with you. The presentation of How Can My Genes Be Patented will last about 40 minutes. Then we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end. Everyone except the speakers will be muted during the webinar, which cuts down on the background noise and ensures that we can all hear well. If you have a question during the webinar, you can type it during the webinar in a pop-up box that should appear on your screen. We'll be keeping track of the questions, and we'll do our very best to answer as many as we can. But given the number of attendees, it's possible we may not get to yours. If we don't get to yours, you can email us afterwards at info@bcaction.org, and we will do our best to answer it then. If you experience any sound quality issues during the webinar, you can try hanging up and calling back in. That usually fixes any problems. You can also call webinar customer support at 800-263-6317. Or if you have any trouble with the visual part of the presentation, try closing down open windows on your computer and just run the presentation. That usually fixes things. We want you all to get involved with Breast Cancer Action. This webinar is a great way to do that. And stay tuned for other ways that we'll mention later on. So now we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to be showing a very short video to kick it off, and then I'll be turning it over to JD. Great, 1 second. Bear with me just 1 second, everyone. Let me get this going. Oops, it looks like we're having a little bit of trouble loading. 1 second while I try to get this on a different page. apologies, everyone. I'm going to give it one more second to load. You'll see in just a moment our Breast Cancer Action's former executive director, Barbara Brenner, is featured in this short film clip that we're showing that was made by our counsel at the ACLU for the Myriad decision that we'll be discussing a bit. And we think that this video is a great introduction to our topic today. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get it started.
How can it be that a company controls genes? How is that possible?
We all know people who've experienced breast cancer.
There are places where the patent system has gone too far, that too much patent protection can in fact trample our liberties.
Mothers and daughters are on the front line in the fight against breast cancer. It's also a high-tech battle. To win, scientists need the freedom to research genes and develop diagnostic testing. But one company, Myriad, decides who gets to test and research 2 genes associated with breast cancer, BRCA1 and 2. All of us, men and women, have these genes. That means the government put a patent on a piece of the human body when it gave Myriad a patent on the BRCA genes.
It doesn't make sense that the government should be able to give people.
My apologies, everyone. It was not doing this when I was testing it earlier. I think what we'll want to do is maybe pause this and get going on the rest of the webinar, and then perhaps we can show this a bit later. So I'm going to escape out of this and just go back to our slides. Okay. All right. So JD, I think I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you and good afternoon to everyone. The video would have talked a little bit more about how odd it is to be giving patents on these segments of DNA. But let's talk first about what a patent is. Patent simply is a license granted by the government to an inventor. It gives the inventor the right through the courts to stop rivals from making, selling, or using an invention without his or her permission. When a patent is granted, the invention becomes property of the inventor. However, the patent can be bought, sold, rented, or hired. Next slide. Okay. Yeah, please understand that this is an extreme summary of what else is important to know. But basically, throughout the world now, patents last normally about 20 years. And in the United States, it's the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office that issues patents, actually one of the first offices set up by the U.S. government. Well, what standards are they supposed to use to decide whether to grant a patent or not? One, patents are supposed to be novel. That means no one else has done it. They are supposed to be non-natural. You can't just find a piece of rock and say, I'm going to patent it. Thirdly, they should be useful. If there's no use for your invention, the patent office is not supposed to grant you a patent on it. And it's not supposed to be just a discovery. Next slide. Well, unfortunately, the U.S. Patent Office ignores a number of these standards and has granted patents on pieces of human DNA, generally known as a gene. There are other parts of DNA that aren't genes that are also being patented, and we're concerned about that too. But of the genes in your body, about 4,000 of those genes have been patented. That's roughly 20% of the genes that are part of how you become you. Okay, next slide. Okay, well, how did we go, from not being able to patent discoveries, not being able to patent things in nature, to patenting so many thousands of genes? Well, up until 1980, no one thought you could. Way back in the early 1920s, when Luther Burbank, a plant breeder, was breeding new plants, the Congress didn't think you could even patent those, so they invented a kind of process. But until 1980, well, they invented a kind of process to allow him to have some control over his plants. But whole animals, genes, couldn't be patented until 1980. And what happened in 1980 was a scientist working for an oil company discovered a bacteria that he thought could be used to clean up oil spills. And he wanted to have the patent on it. So in 1980, the Supreme Court, in the case Diamond versus Chakrabarty, ruled in favor of the scientist, Anand Mohan Chakrabarty, who claimed that he had engineered a bacteria to eat oil. Turned out not to work so well, but he got the patent anyway. And the court ruled in a 5-4 decision that the genetically engineered bacterium was not a product of nature because it had been engineered. And it was useful because it could be used to help clean up oil spills. And so as a non-product of nature and a useful product, it was patentable under the patent statute. Well, the Patent Office took this little bit of change and made a big change. And by 2011, there are thousands of gene patents. There are patents on tests for genes, patents on copies of genes, patents on even little parts of genes. So next slide. Well, if you're someone who has discovered these genes, why do you want to patent it? Well, holding a patent on a human, plant, or animal gene gives the holder control over the commercial exploitation of that gene, whether it's being used for diagnosis or therapy. And even the plant or animal genes can have a lot of effect on human health because they may involve research on disease. They, transferring a gene from one organism to another is very often done to make models for disease organisms. And the first whole animal patented in 1987 was the Harvard DuPont oncomouse used to test for breast cancer drugs. Next slide. Well, can a patent stop research? Well, yes and no. One of the advantages of the patent system is that it requires the inventor to publish details of her or his invention, allowing scientists and others to study it. But in the case of gene patents, research has still been stopped by patent holders in many cases. The patent holders are afraid that when a researcher tries to do research, they will be trying to make commercial use of the developments based on the original patent by going into partnership with a drug firm or by charging patients even at cost for a genetic test. And so the patent holder can step in and try to stop them or force them to pay a licensing fee. Myriad Genetics, by the way, has only, to my knowledge, licensed their gene test to 3 other organizations, and each of those are in vitro fertilization clinics that would be testing to see whether an embryo has the gene or not. Next slide, please. Well, so there are companies that are winners and companies that are losers. The winners in this patent lottery are the companies that first discover the gene. 20 years ago, it was very expensive to isolate a gene, and so the companies say we should be able to have the patent because we discovered it and it was expensive for us to do. It's expensive to fly to the moon, but you don't get to claim it because you're the first that flew there. The losers then are the companies that want to develop products that use the knowledge of the gene to make tests, to make drugs, and the ultimate losers are all of us. Well, there's another problem. Next slide. There's another problem with patenting genes, and that's that in many cases, in fact most cases, there are multiple genes or genetic variants that are associated with the disease, for example, with Alzheimer's or with heart disease, with asthma, diabetes. Most cancers have many genes correlated with them, not just one, and multiple sclerosis. Next slide. A recent study, in fact, just last month, a study in the United Kingdom looked at the DNA from nearly 10,000 people with MS and compared it to 17,376 healthy people. This is the largest study of that disease. What they found was that there are 29 variants of the multiple sclerosis gene. So if you have a patent on one variant, you can exclude testing for all the other ones. So you have a serious problem in that you've got multiple genes that cause disease, and then you've got multiple variants of the gene that can each have their own patent. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and thank you. I'll be available for questions afterwards.
Great, thank you, JD. As was mentioned, my name is Eric Hoffman, and I'm the Biotechnology Policy Campaigner at Friends of the Earth. We're an environmental and social justice organization with sister groups in 76 countries around the world. And today I'm going to highlight some additional problems with gene patents outside those already mentioned by JD. In particular, I'll focus on how gene patents harm patients, how they harm researchers, and how gene patents can limit the general scientific pursuit of knowledge and some other more broad impacts. Next slide. First, gene patents have been shown to limit patient access to potentially life-saving genetic tests. Some genetic diagnostic tests that involve patented genes have been found to have prohibitively high costs for patients. The most egregious example is Myriad Genetics, which charges over $3,000 and sometimes up to $4,000 to test for the BRCA1 and 2 genes. These high costs don't have much to do with the actual cost of providing the test, though. Other labs have reported that they could test for the same gene mutations for only a few $100s, compared to up to $4,000. Next, not all health insurance providers, including some state Medicaid programs, cover the cost of these expensive patented diagnostic tests, such as the Myriad BRCA test. And this has led to growing health disparities in genomic and personalized medicine for ethnic, racial minorities, and other underserved populations. For example, a recent study found that certain BRCA mutations, those that are mostly found in people of Latin American and Caribbean ancestry, are not picked up by Myriad's standard BRCA test. Instead, these patients must take the BRCA analysis large rearrangement test, also known as the BART, which costs an additional $700 and is usually not covered by most insurers because it is considered investigational. And lastly, and one of the more troubling facts about gene patents is that they can prevent patients from receiving a second opinion test to confirm their test results, since that second opinion would violate the gene patent. Myriad Genetics, who owns the BRCA genes, has prevented other labs from providing second opinion tests to patients. Next slide. Gene patents have also been found to limit researchers' access to genetic information. For example, 53% of those genetics labs surveyed in 2003 said that their lab had stopped research on certain genes due to concerns around gene patents and fear of possible legal action. 49% of the American Society of Human Genetics members said that gene patents limited their research in a survey conducted in 2001. And studies have also found that the information published in peer-reviewed journals on genes that have been patented has declined significantly, seriously limiting the general knowledge on these genes and their correlation to certain diseases, how strong those correlations are, etc. These patents have also prevented other labs from creating more effective, more accurate, and more affordable genetic tests. So for example, for a period of time, Myriad's method of testing had a false negative rate that was about 12%. But unfortunately, no one else could test to see how accurate Myriad's test really was, or to develop a more accurate test, because doing so would violate their gene patent. Next slide. A broader problem is the impact gene patents are having on research agendas. More broadly, the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Genetics, Health, and Society, which used to be housed under the Department of Health and Human Services before it was canceled, actually found that gene patents are in fact not needed for labs to develop genetic tests. And there are other motivating factors that have actually led to the discovery of genes and their correlation with disease. So such as general benefit to patients, trying to advance scientific knowledge, needing to be published in order to get tenure. They found that these factors were much more important in discovering genes that correlate with, to disease than the actual pursuit of a patent. Even so, the industry argues that patents are necessary for them to develop tests and to conduct research on genes because they would invest a lot of money and time in doing so. But what this does is drive research into what is patentable. So today, and it drives research away from the actual causes of disease and the environmental factors that lead to increased risk for disease, such as breast cancer and its link to certain chemical exposures. So, one cannot patent the discovery that a certain toxin causes a certain disease, since this is a simple mental process that can't be patented. But they can patent a gene and say its mutation leads to a certain disease. So companies will invest less time, money, and resources into the causes of disease, and more time, money, and resources into what will make them a profit. And patents are the supposed economic incentive to find the gene-to-disease correlation according to these companies, even though research has shown otherwise. Next slide. And here's just a little cartoon, I guess, to show the point of that last slide that I think kind of is emblematic of the current corporate research agenda in a world where genes are allowed to be patented. Next slide. And while Myriad and the BRCA1 and 2 genes are the main gene patents being discussed today, since Myriad has been the most egregious in its defense of of its patents, there are many other patented human genes that have stopped research and harmed patients. These include genes that correlate with increased risk for hemochromatosis, myotonic dystrophy, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, Canavan's disease, Huntington's disease, and even Parkinson's disease. All of these have genes that are patented that are correlated to increased risk for these diseases. Some of them had led to labs stopping their research on these genes because of the patent and fear of possible litigation. Next slide. And it's not just human genes that are patented. As JD had mentioned earlier, there are thousands of patented plant, animal, bacteria, and even virus genes that have been patented and have brought along a number of associated problems. So for example, there was previously a race to patent the SARS virus and the avian flu genomes. These patent races were found to scare away some labs from trying to develop vaccines, since they were trying to avoid potential legal troubles. Next, biopiracy highlights another realm of concerns around gene patents. Cases of biopiracy usually involve a company, often from the US or Europe, going into a community in the global south and patenting plants and other biological materials for agriculture, pharmaceutical, and other applications. So one major example was about a decade ago when a Texas-based rice corporation tried patenting basmati rice that we all know, which had been developed by Indian farmers for over thousands of years. They went in, they sequenced the genome and claimed that sequencing of the genome that they've invented basmati rice all of a sudden. But thankfully, due to public outcry, they abandoned their patent application. But even so, biopiracy remains a major problem more broadly, and natural resources are routinely stolen from communities through patents on naturally occurring DNA sequences. There are also many religious communities that are concerned about gene patents, since they see these patents as an attempt to commoditize parts of God's creation. In 1995, nearly 200 religious leaders from Christian, Jewish, Islamic, Buddhist, and other faith groups called on the U.S. Patent Office to stop patenting genes, as they believe that genes were creations of God, not human creations. The World Council of Churches has also taken a position against gene patents. And with that, I will turn it over to Kim at Breast Cancer Action to discuss what we can do about the problems caused by gene patents. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric. So Breast Cancer Action thought it was really important that we join a case against Myriad Genetics. The case is called Association for Molecular Pathology et al. Versus the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. We've been a plaintiff in the lawsuit since 2009. And the reason we joined is because we believe it's wrong for the government to give one company the power to dictate all scientific and medical uses of genes that each of us has in our bodies. We really need more and better options for the treatment and risk reduction of breast cancer, and we can't afford to have progress stymied by the monopolies that gene patents create. Breast Cancer Action has a very strict corporate contributions policy, and it's because of that that we were able to join the lawsuit against Myriad Genetics. So a little bit of history about this case. In March 2010, a district court in New York sided with us, the ACLU, which is our attorneys in this case, and other plaintiffs when it ruled that genes are facts of nature and therefore are unpatentable. The decision was appealed, of course, and unfortunately was recently overturned in July of this year by the Federal Court of Appeals. The court ruled in that case, or the court made a decision that isolated naturally occurring genes and DNA sequences are patentable. However, we didn't lose on all counts. The decision was 2-1, with the dissent providing very strong support for why genes should not be patentable. And in addition to that, the appeals court did agree with the lower court on one point when it said that Myriad's patents on simply comparing a normal BRCA gene with a mutated gene were invalid, since the act of comparing is a simple mental process and cannot be patented. Now, where does it leave this today? Where are we going with this case? So, because there was a dissenting judge, it's possible that the entire Court of Appeals will take up this case with 10 judges in an en banc hearing. And a lot of people who are following this case think it might be likely that it would end up with the Supreme Court. So our commitment is to keep our members and everybody else who is interested in this case informed of where Breast Cancer Action is with this appeal. And lastly, we want to talk a little bit about what you can do related to gene patenting. So, as we're following the case, organizations that are able to should think about whether they can write an amicus brief to explain why they don't think that genes are patentable. A number of organizations have already submitted similar briefs to the 2 lower courts, and some of these groups might look for other signatories during the next round if you can't write your own. That's something to think about, and we can keep our members informed about that. Please go ahead and email us if you're interested in learning more about doing that. Additionally, there are a number of groups working together in coalition to support legislation that would ban the patenting of genes. Similar legislation was introduced back in 2007 by Congressman Becerra and Weldon, and currently we're looking to have legislation introduced during this session of Congress. If your organization is interested in joining the coalition, you could let Breast Cancer Action know. And in addition to that, when it's introduced, we would encourage our members and anyone else who's interested to personally support it by calling your legislators and asking them to co-sponsor the legislation or vote in favor of it. We also encourage everyone to, who's on the webinar today, to talk to your friends, your family, and your coworkers about why you're concerned about this issue with gene patents. It's really important that this issue is discussed freely and that we get a groundswell of people to contact their members of Congress to inform their communities about this issue and to show strong opposition publicly to having our genes patented. And finally, you can become a member of Breast Cancer Action if you aren't already a member to stay informed about the lawsuit's progress, any legislative efforts we've mentioned, and other news about this issue. So finally, before we get to any questions, we wanted to thank all of you for your attention during this presentation. We have our websites listed up on the screen right now, bcaction.org and thinkbeforeyouPink.org, where you can learn more about Breast Cancer Action's work. In addition, please contact us. We've listed our email address and our toll-free number on the screen here. And we, as we said earlier, we don't take any money from corporations that profit from or contribute to the breast cancer epidemic. And individual support of our work is crucial so that we can continue to fight this fight against Myriad. If you've been inspired today, please consider making a donation of $25 or more so we can continue these webinars and our other work. You can go to bcaction.org/donate. Now we're going to look at some questions that we've got. One second. Sorry, everybody, I'm just looking for the... there we go. Sorry about that, everyone. I was having trouble locating what happened to the questions. Okay, here we go. All right. So the first question looks like it starts out with a comment. This issue reminds me of the HeLa cells originally taken from Henrietta Lacks's tissue. What other similarities do you see in this? Do either of you, I've read the book, the Henrietta Lacks book, and I think that's a really interesting point. I think that, making sure that that patients are, well informed of what decisions are made about their bodies and that they have complete say over it is obviously a very important issue.
Yeah, this is JD. I've read the book too, and I'm quite familiar with the case. Her cells aren't the only ones that have been taken and actually patented and used for research. Hers are probably the most used in research. But it's another example of why we shouldn't be able to patent any genes. They shouldn't be patentable. It was criminal to the extent that they kept from her and from her family all those years what they were doing with her cells. But the other problem is, in some of these cases, families that had particular diseases donated tissues so that scientists could find the genes, and now the families have to pay for tests that they helped develop.
Wow, that is really appalling. The next question we have is, would it be more, and I don't know the answer to this myself, but I will throw this out there, would it be more beneficial to get tested for the BRCA gene abroad, where Myriad does not hold a monopoly or patent on the gene, if you know that it's already in your family history? Do either of you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Well, this is, sort of it's a difficult question because not everybody can go abroad to get the test. Mm-hmm. And, yes, you could go to Canada, yes, you can go to Europe, but, it shouldn't be patentable here in the first place. So I'm not going to tell someone not go get the test, but I would say write to your member of Congress and say, why in the world am I having to go to Canada or Europe to get this test?
I think that's a really good point, JD. I mean, that's a really clear example of how it decreases people's access here to a test or a second opinion about something about their bodies. And the people who are going to be hit the hardest are those with more limited means. And that's really unfair.
Yeah.
The next question I'm seeing is asking whether we can talk at all about genetic alliances arguments in support of gene patents, and are they the only patient-focused group supporting patents? Any knowledge about that with either of you two?
Yeah, again, the genetic alliance groups are mostly these groups that are single genes and small orphan groups. Not criticizing their executive director, but their executive director even has patents on genes. But the real problem is that while you might argue that for some really orphan diseases, you need incentives to help people dig out and find the gene, and that there might be extremely limited cases. But for most of us that have diseases like asthma, diseases like diabetes, heart disease, even colon cancer, while there's genes identified for it, probably involves more than those genes. So, someone having a patent on even one of those genes interferes with our being able to understand how it all works together.
Great, thank you. The next question we have is asking for a little more detail about the recent decision. With the appeals court, what did Myriad both win and lose in the most recent Federal Court of Appeals case? Eric, I was wondering if you would feel comfortable chatting a little bit about that. I know you recently wrote an article about the decision.
Yeah, sure. So what Myriad won is they won back their patents on the BRCA1 and 2 gene. As Kim said earlier, they were originally struck down last year in the district court, and now the Court of Appeals overruled that decision and said that, in fact, the BRCA1 and 2 genes are patentable. The majority opinion argued that since the genes were isolated and since covalent bonds were broken between the natural gene in the human body and through the act of isolation and purification, that was an inventive step worthy of a patent to Myriad. And I think we would, those of us on the call would agree that just that act of isolating isn't an inventive step because the DNA sequence, even if it's isolated outside the body, has to be exactly the same as the DNA sequence inside the body, or else Myriad's test wouldn't even work. What they lost was another patent that's different than the actual gene patent, but it was a patent on comparing naturally occurring non-mutated BRCA gene with a mutated BRCA gene. The Court of Appeals agreed with the lower court when it overruled that, when it got rid of that patent as well, saying that the simple act of comparing is not enough to warrant a patent, because anyone can put two DNA sequences next to each other and see where mutations occur. And as Kim said, this case is likely far from over. There'll probably be an en banc hearing for the full Federal Court of Appeals, and it's most likely going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so while Myriad won back its BRCA1 and 2 gene patents last month, it's likely that the case is going to keep moving forward, and that might change.
Great, thank you. JD, do you have anything that you would like to add to that, or?
No, I think that's a good summary. Probably better to take more questions.
Okay, great. I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions from our folks. I think we might be winding down. One of the other things I can do that I'd be happy to try is to try showing the rest of the video. I think we have answered everything. Just one more check. Okay. Here's another one. It seems that the Patent Office did not look at the bigger picture. Is that their job?
Well, you know, the U.S. Patent Office looks at the bigger picture much more narrowly than, say, the French Patent Office. The French patent law has a clause that requires patents that they grant to, to have to conform to morality, which is an interesting phrase. My favorite example of a patent they didn't issue. They didn't issue a patent on a mouse to test drugs for male pattern baldness, but they did issue the patent on the mouse to test drugs for human breast cancer. They thought that it was immoral to torture mice just for a drug to grow more hair on a guy's head. But they have addressed better than we some of the other moral issues that our patent office just rejects out of hand. The religious leaders met with the patent office, and the notion that the religious leaders thought that the patent office was actually violating their religious freedom was, the people understood it individually at the patent office, but didn't understand it corporately.
And then I would just add, if I can, Kim.
Oh, of course.
That regardless of how narrow or broadly the patent office views the scope and looking at some of these broader issues, in the end, I think it's going to have to come to Congress to weigh in on this decision. So far, besides the 2007 Becerra bill that was mentioned earlier, Congress hasn't weighed in either way on whether or not genes are patentable or not. And the Constitution grants Congress the power to say what is patentable. And even the Court of Appeals said a number of times in their recent decision that Congress will need to weigh in. So even if we win on the BRCA genes against Myriad, there's still the 4,000 plus other human genes that have been patented that need to be dealt with. So I think in the end, regardless of where the Patent Office lands, Congress will need to step in and hopefully on the right side and say that genes are facts of nature and are not patentable.
Great, thank you. We've answered all the questions that have been posed. I want to give people maybe another minute or so to write in any other questions they have. And while we're letting folks do that, I'm going to try to queue up the video because I thought it would be a nice way to end. It's only about 5 minutes long. So, any other questions from folks? These are really great questions. I think they go to a lot of the key issues that we and many other organizations have really grappled with. And we certainly appreciate JD and Eric's expertise on this issue. Incidentally, the two of them co-authored a piece that we had, Breast Cancer Action had in one of our most recent source issues, which is our newsletter. And if you're interested, it's on our website, and I encourage you to read more about what they had to say on this. Just double check one more time for questions, and I will try to queue up the video. Okay. Oh, crash report. Maybe that's why. It may not work any better, but I will give it one more shot. Yeah, it looks like it.
How can it be that a company controls genes? How is that possible?
We all know people who've experienced
Mothers and daughters are on the front line in the fight against breast cancer. It's also a high-tech battle. To win, scientists need the freedom to research genes and develop diagnostic testing. But one company, Myriad, decides who gets to test and research 2 genes associated with breast cancer. BRCA1 and 2. All of us, men and women, have these genes. That means the government put a patent on a piece of the human body when it gave Myriad a patent on the BRCA gene.
It doesn't make sense that the government should be able to give people control over human genes. And it's been a long-standing rule of patent law that you can't patent a product of nature or a law of nature.
Mutations on the BRCA gene can mean increased risk of breast and ovarian cancer. Elizabeth Seriani had breast cancer that resulted in a double mastectomy. If she has a mutation on her BRCA gene, it could signal more cancer to come.
as a single mother, I'd like to see my daughter go off to graduate from college. And if I have the mutation, there's a huge chance that I'll end up with ovarian cancer in the immediate future.
But because the government granted a patent on both the genes and any mutations, Myriad is the only place Elizabeth can turn to see if she's more likely to get ovarian cancer.
Like the government created this monopoly by giving them the patent, by giving Myriad the patent in the first place. I don't know what they're thinking.
Like many women, Elizabeth can't afford the more than $3,000 Myriad wants for the test, and getting it covered by insurance can be complicated or impossible.
I don't even have a credit card sitting with $300 that I could just charge. and have it be done. I need to have that test so I can get them out if I need to before anything happens. I don't really like those odds.
Dr. Wendy Chung, a clinician and geneticist at Columbia University, says there are problems with the patents beyond cost. The patents limit information that is crucial to women and their doctors.
So for women, as they're trying to make these major life decisions, it's very helpful for them to have a second opinion, much as they would get a second opinion for a surgeon. By having only a single laboratory offering that testing, it's impossible really to be able to get that second opinion, either in the way that the test is performed or the interpretation of such results. And that's been problematic for women in the field.
You know, ovary removal is, you are deciding whether or not you can have children. And to me, that's a huge, huge decision. I did not have the option to go to anybody else to validate the test. And that was very scary when you're a patient.
Minority women have an additional concern, genetic variants of uncertain significance. Initial gene studies focused on white women, and now the patents make it more difficult to learn what some mutations mean in women of color, because Myriad has total control over researchers' access to those mutations.
It's really frustrating not to be able to have this information, because I would love to be able to find out why, and not just for myself, but other Asians also. I believe in being proactive about my health, and having that patent makes it really difficult to be very proactive.
They own not only the genes, they own any future test, any future drug, any future therapy. So it means that we're putting our trust in one single company.
We're asking the court to declare the patents invalid. If the court does that, then the tens of thousands of researchers around the country who have the technical ability to look at breast cancer genes can do that freely.
We need better options. And the research on these genes might get us to that, but not if Myriad holds all the cards.
Okay, that's the end of the video.
As
Oh,
a
just about.
Advocate, I think we're really concerned anytime we see the government interfering with something so elemental as women's bodies.
We don't do cases in order to win an abstract principle. We do cases that are going to affect people's lives. This case will affect people's lives.
So, who got the HO?
Okay, that's really the end of the video. Apologies again for the technical difficulties, and thank you for your patience. But I'm really glad that we could do that. We could show that to you guys. Thought it was a very well done video, and it really captures a lot of the really key points that we went over during this webinar, and it connects, I think, the issue to real women in a very nice way as well. And that's something to keep in mind. I'm going to see if we have any other questions, because it looks like we do have a few minutes left in the webinar. And I definitely encourage those of you who are on to, if you have any questions, please do let us know. I'm not seeing any new ones. Any last thoughts, Eric or JD?
Well, I think I'd mostly thank you for your work on this. And some of that's personal. My grandmother died of breast cancer. One of my cousins has had breast cancer, and these are important issues for all of our families. Whether or not we've had breast cancer or not, we're all going to have diseases that have some correlation with our DNA, and it shouldn't be controlled by just one company or even two or three.
Absolutely.
And I just wanted to thank Breast Cancer Action for hosting the webinar, and for everyone for joining. And as Kim had mentioned, if you have questions later on, feel free to get in touch with me or JD or Breast Cancer Action at any time. We'd be happy to answer your questions for you.
Yeah, thank you so much again, JD and Eric. We are so thrilled that both of you could lend your expertise to this issue to help us present on it, and we are really excited about the issue moving forward. We'll be following the case, of course, as it progresses, and any legislative efforts we are really excited to see as well. So please, to everyone on the webinar, we thank you for joining us, and we encourage you to join Breast Cancer Action and to stay involved on this issue. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.